Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rob. Let's draw Daenerys Targaryen. Daenerys Targaryen, or as she's more commonly known as Khaleesi, is a character from the wildly successful Game of Thrones TV series and the moderately successful books. Yeah. So for this composition, I know that I want Daenerys in the forefront, and I know that I want most of her body to be visible. And I also know that I want one of her dragons in there as well. So, two characters that kind of gives you an awkward situation to try and draw. The reason being, you want to apply what is known as the rule of odds, which basically just states that things that are, like it sounds, that show up in odd numbers are more pleasing than things that are not. So when you have two subjects, you gotta find some way to make it feel like there's actually three. Or disguise the two subjects inside of a different kind of composition so that it's less boring, I guess. I want to find another word to describe it, but that's really the only reason that rule exists. You don't want your composition to be boring. And when you have two mirrored things, it can very easily fall into that trap. So I'm leveraging another composition rule. Essentially, when you have something arranged such that it forms a triangle, triangles are pleasing shapes. Triangles are very nice to look at. They're good to the eye. They are indispensable. So in this case, I've got a very subtle triangle formed from the top of Khaleesi's head, going down her left arm, and then the other side of the triangle goes from the top of her head across the top of her dragon's head, and then this shape follows through with the dragon's wing. So you get this nice balanced triangle. I mean, it's not equilateral, but it is balanced on the page. And that helps strengthen what would otherwise be an unwieldy composition, just having two major items in it. Khaleesi's head sits on a PowerPoint. It's a third of the way into the page from the edge and a third of the way down from the top. This composition makes it fall on points that the eye is drawn naturally toward in a drawing or any kind of work. You saw earlier that when I drew out my guidelines, these were the first things that I put down. The reason for that being, when you align things in your composition such that they fall on these areas, these PowerPoints, following the rule of thirds, you get a stronger composition, you gain more impact, you can lead the viewer's eye better. So, having established that, I did as I've always done. Simple pencil, worked down some tones, and then started throwing in a color wash behind it. In this case, however, I did not actually do any pencils for the backgrounds. It was just simply a color wash with a slightly different brush than I normally use. This actually has texture to it. I chose it because it gave the piece more of a painterly feel, and it allowed me to bring across the idea of a mountainside with rocks and vegetation, things like that, without spending too much time rendering a lot of details. Because the time that I do have, I want to spend on the objects in the foreground. Aside from that though, these are my standard simple round brushes, things like that. So here I am, knocking in details of the face. Nothing too spectacular this time, much like before. I'm following the same principles and rules that I've applied in previous videos. As you can see though, when I filled in the whites of the eyes, I used the ambient color of the sky. In this case, it's very easy because the sky is for the most part uniform. You generally want to use the ambient color of whatever your scene is. It doesn't have to be the sky. If it takes place inside of a dimly lit building, then of course it would be a darker shade of gray, things like that. But you want to use the most prevalent ambient color in your scene to inform the color that you use to paint the whites of the eyes. Now here, as I'm doing the face, I have a rather strong light. The sun coming from the top left. Now the face isn't a flat plane. It has subtle ridges and bumps, and as you can see there, the shadow of the nose is cast across the cheek, but there's a part of the cheek just beneath the eye that juts out a bit more. There's a lot of flesh there, so that part won't be hidden in shadow as much as the rest of that side of the face. It's a small detail, yes, but it does make a difference, and it's something that is sometimes forgotten. As you can see there, I changed her expression a bit. I wasn't sure initially what I would have her looking at, but I decided that I should have her looking at her Drake. She, in the show, is obviously very in love with her dragons. And in this piece, I would want to make sure that what I'm making sure that the characters have some sort of interaction. Yes, she's resting her hand on his muzzle, but I want to add a little bit more to that. I don't want her looking off of the page to the distance, making the viewer have to question what is it she's considering, things like that. I want to make sure that I link Daenerys and her dragon. So having her gaze cast down to look sort of at the dragon or maybe just above it, it subtly ties things back around in composition. Unlike the show, I made sure that I gave Daenerys resting bitch face. Reason being, she's not, in my opinion, a very likable character. Her motives are, much like everyone else, very suspect and not entirely noble. So rather than portray her as this, sweet, innocent child, I'm sort of painting her as a foil for Cersei, who is almost universally reviled. Now here I'm just evening out my shadows and making sure the values around her face work. I'm giving her darker eyes, sort of to push across the idea that she is not exactly a very nice person. The hair is very easy to render. Nothing too special going on here. I started to do a flyaway piece, just to give it motion, but then decided against it. One detail that I feel is, or at least that I've noticed is lacking in a lot of the Game of Thrones fan art that I've seen, is that Daenerys is not portrayed as she is in these fan arts as she is in the book. It seems like most people, understandably so, follow what they've seen on the show. which means that a lot of the fan art is really just Emilia Clarke. But according to the books, when the events first pick up, when the very first book starts, Daenerys is 13 years old, not very sure of herself, really just a puppet, being, you know, sold into this arranged marriage by her brother in a bid to gain back the throne of Westeros. So, understandably, you can't have a 13-year-old child getting sold into marriage and being manhandled and having all the things happen to her that we've seen Daenerys go through. But I think but that's really just because it has to follow television standards, right? It has to be marketable, this product needs to be sold. When you're doing fan art, though, you can remain truer to the actual work. You can keep things as they were originally conceived by the authors. So you may have noticed it here, especially now that there's a little bit more detail. I have kept the general anatomy and proportions that Daenerys should have. She's not a queen, she's still just a child. She's a princess, really. So, of course, she would have, you know, the skinny limbs, the knobby elbows, things like that. A head that seems almost disproportionate, that sort of thing. 'Cause she's still growing, she's still a person. The fact that she, for a while, carried Drogo's baby should have been more impactful than it was in the show. I think by aging her up, the network was able to show a lot more, you know, stay more true to the events of the book, but at the same time, a bit of what makes happen to her so horrible is lost. So in this, I wanted to make sure that I preserved the overall age of the character. We should feel like this is a little girl trying to be a queen. And you should really feel like you're looking at a child soldier, right? Because that's essentially what she's become. I don't know, that was my philosophy. So, as I painted her, I made sure to keep in mind, much like the statue of David, you know, this is not an adult, this is an awkwardly proportioned teenager. Now, as I was painting in the dress, it occurred to me that this dress is not, there's not enough going on visually. It's rather plain, very simplistic. And understandably so. But it left a very dead spot in the composition. I mean, the blue was, I intentionally chose these color palettes because the dress itself had to be blue, and by making it this nice cold but very bold blue color and having it contrast with this warm background, she pops out a bit more, especially given the fact that she has, you know, very white hair, that sort of thing. But it still felt like the dress itself didn't have enough texture, enough quality to it to really give the eye something to latch onto. It was very plain and felt almost too simple. So I added a bit of detail using a speckle brush to try and sort of give it this reflective sequin type of look to it, which is not entirely accurate, but it did something to eliminate what would otherwise be an incredibly boring, flat area leading down her body, down her torso in this dress. And the gradient was simply just to help punch up the contrast so it didn't feel so flat. Again though, that's showing you that to make something brighter, like the highlights or the light on her falling across her face, things like that, you don't necessarily need to increase its value. You can make things brighter by making everything else darker. You need the dark to bring out the light. So now that I'm satisfied with what I've done with Daenerys, and I have established solid lighting for the scene on her, I'm moving on to the Drake. Now her dragon, there's several references to it, screen caps, things like that, but as I looked at them in detail, I started to realize that they were, understandably so, very simple CG. There's not a whole lot of texture to them, there's not a whole lot of color variation, things like that, so I figured I would take a few basic liberties with the dragon, seeing as how there isn't really too much to go on. For the face, I made sure that it felt like a raptor, and then for the spines across the body, things like that of the Drake, I thought that it would make more sense to have it seem like an iguana. Adding those extra spikes enabled me to do things like sort of give it what appears to be a brow. That way it's a little more expressive. Same thing with the teeth, those are crocodile teeth, but it makes it feel more like a puppy, more like it's looking at her like a pet.